Dragons are, without question, the single most mishandled monster in Dungeons & Dragons, and I will die on this hill. Every table's got a dragon story, and it's almost always the same story. The DM cracked open the monster manual, found a big scary number, slapped it at the end of a dungeon, and called it a boss fight. Meanwhile the dragon, an ancient, godlike intellect that's been alive since before your grandparents' grandparents were a thought in the multiverse, fights like a golem with a better paint job. It just stands there. It breathes fire. It maybe bites somebody. Then it dies to 4 5th-level idiots because nobody at the table, including the person running it, actually understood what a dragon is supposed to be. So today we're talking about dragons, and not in the, here's a cool lore dump about Bahamut and Tiamat way, because frankly you can get that from a wiki. We're talking about why the single most iconic creature in the entire game keeps getting used like a glorified damage sponge instead of the terrifying, ancient, borderline unkillable force of nature it's written to be. Pray to whichever metallic or chromatic deity you vibe with, because we've got some sacred cows to slaughter today, and I promise you at least one of them is going to be a dragon you personally love. Let's start with the obvious one, intelligence. Dragons are, on a raw stat block level, some of the smartest creatures in the entire game. A young dragon's got an intelligence score that'd make most wizards blush, and by the time you're dealing with an ancient dragon, you are talking about a being that has had literal centuries, sometimes millennia, to think about exactly one thing: how to not die to adventurers. That's it. That's the whole job. Dragons that have survived long enough to become ancient did so specifically because they got good at not getting murdered by parties of overconfident weirdos with swords. And yet, at the vast majority of tables, that dragon fights like it forgot all of that the second combat started. It sits in the middle of the room and takes hits. It doesn't use the terrain. It doesn't retreat to heal, even though it absolutely has the wing speed to just leave and come back later on its own terms. It doesn't target the squishy sorcerer first, even though any creature with half a brain would immediately clock the guy in robes as the actual threat. A genuinely smart ancient red dragon should be an absolute nightmare to fight, not because of its damage numbers, but because it refuses to fight fair, ever, on principle, because fighting fair is how you end up stuffed and mounted on some paladin's wall. And look, I get it. I do. Running a dragon, smart, is legitimately hard. You, the DM, have got 4 sheets of paper to track, initiative to manage, and a table full of people staring at you waiting for something to happen, and in the middle of all that you're supposed to be role-playing the tactical genius of a creature that's older than most nations. That's a big ask. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's necessary, because a dragon that doesn't act like the smartest thing in the room stops being a dragon and starts being a big red damage number with wings, and that's just sad. That's like ordering a 5-course meal and getting a single chicken nugget. Technically food. Not what was promised. Then there's the breath weapon problem, and this one's almost worse because it's baked into the system itself. Recharge on a short or long rest. That's the deal. Which means in the vast majority of fights, a dragon gets to breathe fire, acid, poison, whatever its flavor is, exactly once, and then it spends the rest of the encounter as a large, angry, but fundamentally mid-melee combatant. Bite, claw, claw. That's a rhythm you'll see out of basically any big monster in this game, and it means the signature, iconic. This is why you're scared of dragon's attack shows up for 1 round out of what could be an 8 or 9 round slugfest. Imagine if a boxer only got to throw their signature haymaker once per fight and then had to spend the rest of the match doing jabs. That's what fighting most dragons actually feels like at the table, and it's a huge part of why so many dragon fights end up feeling like a letdown compared to the hype. The breath weapon is supposed to be the moment where the whole party collectively goes, "Oh, we are so unbelievably cooked," and instead it's a single line item on round 1 that then just doesn't come back up. This is where legendary actions and Lair actions are supposed to save the day, and to be fair, they genuinely help. A dragon acting on its own turn, then getting to do stuff on everyone else's turn too, is a real mechanical improvement, and Lair actions specifically are one of the better pieces of monster design in the whole game because they let the dragon's home turf actively work against the party instead of just being a pretty backdrop. The problem is I don't think enough DMs actually run these to their full potential. Legendary actions in the books read like a checklist: tail attack, wing attack, detect, and a lot of tables run them exactly like a checklist too, cycling through the same 3 options mechanically instead of using them to actually punish the party for bad positioning or reward the dragon for playing smart. A wing attack that knocks the fighter prone right before the dragon's actual turn so it can follow up with a full attack against a prone target isn't just using a legendary action, it's the dragon being clever, and that distinction matters a lot more than people give it credit for. And can we talk about the Hoard for a second? Because dragons hoarding treasure is like the single most iconic dragon trait there is, right up there with breathing fire and being enormous. It's baked into the mythology going back centuries before D&D even existed. And yet at most tables, the Hoard is just loot. It's a pile of gold and a couple of magic items behind a locked door, and the party cracks it open like a piñata after the fight's over. There's no personality to it. Meanwhile, the actual lore, and honestly some of the better published adventures, treat a dragon's hoard as basically an extension of its ego. Dragons are supposed to know every single item in that hoard, remember exactly how they got it, and notice, immediately, viscerally, if so much as one coin goes missing. That's not a treasure chest, that's a body part. Running a hoard like that, where the dragon has genuine emotional attachment to specific weird objects in the pile, does more to make a dragon feel ancient and alive than another 10 points of intelligence ever could. Speaking of feeling alive, let's talk about the color-coded alignment thing, because I have thoughts. Chromatic dragons bad, metallic dragons good, and that's sort of it, that's the whole pitch, and I understand why it exists from a game design standpoint. It's clean. It's readable. New players can look at a red dragon and instantly go, oh, that one's evil, cool, got it. But it also means the vast majority of dragons that show up in actual games are functionally the same personality wearing different scale colors. Greedy and cruel if chromatic, wise and aloof if metallic, and that's the whole character. A red dragon that's greedy because it genuinely, pathologically cannot stand the idea of anyone else having nice things is a much more interesting villain than a red dragon that's greedy because the book says red dragons are greedy. The color can inform the temperament without being the entire personality, and I think a lot of tables, mine included at various points, have leaned on the color as a crutch instead of building an actual character underneath it. Now here's the part where I get to be genuinely mad about something, because I've got to talk about the classic dragon at the end of the dungeon problem, and this one's more about encounter design than the dragon itself. So many campaigns treat the dragon like the final boss of a video game level. You clear the goblins, you clear the ogres, you clear the weird cult doing weird cult things, and then, surprise, dragon, big fight, loot, done. And the issue with that structure is it treats the dragon as the climax of a dungeon crawl instead of what it actually should be, which is the climax of an entire arc. A dragon showing up cold at the end of a dungeon with zero buildup is exactly how you get a fight that feels like a stat block instead of a threat. Compare that to a dragon the party's heard rumors about for 6 sessions, whose lair they've scouted from a distance, whose past victims they've met, whose hoard they've heard described by terrified survivors, before they ever actually see the thing. By the time that fight happens, the party's scared of it before initiatives even rolled, and that fear does more heavy lifting for the encounter than any amount of extra hit points ever will. And okay, real quick, because I promised myself I wouldn't turn this into a full rant but here we are, can we stop making every single dragon encounter a straight-up brawl in an open room? Dragons fly. That is, hands down, their single biggest tactical advantage over a party of ground-bound adventurers, and so many fights just don't use it. The dragon lands, stays landed, and fights like an oversized dog for the whole encounter. Meanwhile, a dragon that actually uses its flight, hovering just out of melee range, dive-bombing the backline, retreating to altitude to force the party to burn ranged resources, completely changes the shape of the fight. Anyways, back to being mad about dragons. There's also the whole question of why a dragon would even be fighting the party in the first place, and I think this gets skipped over constantly. A creature that intelligent, that old, that powerful, generally doesn't want to fight a group of strangers to the death over principle. It wants something. Maybe it wants the party gone and would honestly rather negotiate than risk even a scratch on its perfect, priceless hide. Maybe it's testing them, genuinely curious whether these particular adventurers are worth the effort of killing outright or worth recruiting as pawns instead. Maybe it already knows it's going to lose this fight and is stalling for time while its actual plan finishes elsewhere, because a smart dragon absolutely has contingencies for the day some overpowered nerds with magic swords finally show up at its door. A fight where the dragon has clear motivations beyond monster in the way, gives the players something to actually engage with beyond hit point math, and it means the encounter can end in more interesting ways than just, everybody dies or the dragon does. I also want to bring up something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, which is dragon fear. There's an actual mechanic for this, frightful presence, and it genuinely never gets used, and it's a shame, because on paper it's one of the more flavorful things a dragon can do to a party before a single die of damage gets rolled. The idea that just being in the presence of something this old and this powerful should rattle a person to their core, make their hands shake around their sword hilt, make the cleric's prayers come out a little less confident than usual, that's such a good piece of design, and so many tables just skip past it as a throwaway saving throw at the start of combat instead of treating it as the opening beat of the whole encounter. Imagine if, before the dragon even acts, the DM takes 30 seconds to actually describe what it's like to stand in a cave that reeks of sulfur and old bone, staring up at something the size of a barn that is very calmly, very patiently, deciding whether you're worth the effort of killing. That's free tension. That costs nothing mechanically and does more work than 3 extra legendary resistances. And it's not just the fighters and rogues who should feel it, either. Spellcasters, the people usually holding the most tactical power at the table, should feel it just as hard, maybe harder, because they're the ones who actually understand, on some level, exactly how far outmatched they are. A wizard who's spent their whole career reading about creatures like this in books is going to have a very different, much worse reaction to actually standing in front of one than a barbarian who mostly just sees a big thing to hit. Playing into that, letting the smartest character at the table be the most rattled one, sells the scale of the threat in a way raw hit points simply cannot. And speaking of legendary resistance, let's talk about that for a second too, because I think it gets a bad reputation it doesn't entirely deserve. People hate legendary resistance. I get why. Nobody likes casting their best spell, watching the DM go, yeah, it just succeeds, don't worry about it, and having that be the entire interaction. It feels bad. It feels like the game reaching over the table and slapping your character sheet out of your hands. But the actual problem isn't that the mechanic exists, it's that it's almost always used silently. A dragon just quietly shrugging off a hold monster spell with zero acknowledgement is bad, sure, but a dragon that visibly, physically strains against the spell, that staggers for half a second before shaking it off with something that looks suspiciously like effort, that tells the party something true and useful, this thing is powerful, but it is not invincible, and it is spending resources to stay that way. Legendary resistance isn't the problem. Using it like a mute button is the problem. Little things like that, a stagger, a grunt of effort, a beat of silence before the dragon shakes it off, cost the DM nothing at the table and completely change how the party reads the fight going forward, which is honestly the theme running through basically this entire video. There's also this weird thing where a lot of dragons just don't talk, and honestly, that one baffles me the most out of everything on this list. We just established these things are ancient geniuses that have been alive for centuries, sometimes longer than most civilizations have existed, and yet at the table they get treated like a big fire-breathing dog that occasionally roars. A dragon should have opinions. It should have things it finds beneath it, things it finds fascinating, maybe even a dry sense of humor about the fact that 4 people it could crush without looking have decided today's the day they die. Some of the best dragon encounters I've ever heard about weren't the ones with the cleverest tactics, they were the ones where the dragon talked to the party first, mocked them a little, maybe even offered them a way out they were too proud to take, and only then did things go loud. A dragon that condescends to you before it eats you is scarier than one that just attacks on sight, because it means the fight was never really in question from the dragon's perspective, and that's terrifying in a way raw damage numbers just can't replicate. Okay, and one more thing. And then I promise I'll wrap this up before I turn into the guy who's been talking about dragons for 3 hours straight at a party nobody invited him to. Scale. Actual physical scale. An ancient dragon is described in the books as being enormous, comparable to a building, and yet so many battle maps depict it as basically a slightly oversized ogre standing in a 5-foot square like everything else on the board. That disconnect matters more than people give it credit for. If the party can't feel, physically, at the table, that this creature is the size of a house, that its tail alone could sweep 3 of them off their feet without even trying, then no amount of stat block flavor text is going to make the fight feel like fighting a dragon instead of fighting a big lizard with a fire attack. Describing the wind off its wings before it even lands. Describing the way the floor of the cave actually cracks a little under its weight. Making the players duck an attack that's coming from an angle they didn't expect because the thing towers over the battlefield instead of sitting flush inside it. That's free. That's just description. And it does more to sell ancient terrifying Wyrm than another whole tier of legendary actions ever could. There's also a whole category of dragons that basically nobody uses, and I mean that almost literally, and that's gem dragons. Amethyst, topaz, sapphire, the whole lineup. They exist. They're in the books. They've got genuinely interesting philosophies, weird psychic abilities, and none of the tired good versus evil baggage that chromatic and metallic dragons are stuck carrying around. And yet I'd bet real money most people reading a gem dragon stat block for the first time are doing it because of this video, not because their DM ever put one in front of them. That's a shame, because a dragon that doesn't slot cleanly into good guy or bad guy, one that operates on some genuinely alien value system where concepts like loyalty or greed just don't map the same way, is exactly the kind of thing that breaks players out of autopilot. They can't just assume the crystal dragon wants to eat them or wants to help them. They actually have to engage with it as a character, and that uncertainty alone is worth more than another point of AC. And can we talk about age categories for a second, because I think most tables treat young, adult, and ancient as basically the same fight with a bigger health bar stapled on, and that's such a waste of what's actually a fantastic built-in escalation tool. A young dragon should feel dangerous but beatable, reckless even, prone to overconfidence because it hasn't lost yet and doesn't fully believe it can. An adult dragon should feel like it's testing the party, probing for weaknesses before committing fully, because it's old enough to have learned caution but not so old it's given up on personally handling threats. An ancient dragon shouldn't really be fighting the party in any conventional sense at all. It should be doing something else entirely while a fraction of its attention deals with them, because from its perspective 4 adventurers are barely worth waking up fully for. Same creature type, 3 completely different postures, and almost none of that comes from the numbers on the stat block. It comes from how the DM decides to play it, which loops right back to the whole point of this video. I'd also be doing a disservice if I didn't bring up Dragonborn for a second, because their whole existence kind of gets treated as this weird footnote to actual dragons instead of what it should be, which is a direct extension of the dragon fantasy. A Dragonborn barbarian breathing acid onto an enemy is, mechanically and thematically, a tiny echo of everything we've just spent this entire video talking about, ancient power boiled down into a single person-shaped vessel. And yet how many tables actually lean into that? How many Dragonborn characters get built with an actual relationship to dragons as a concept, versus just being a lizard guy with a breath weapon because the player thought the mechanics looked cool? There's a whole vein of storytelling sitting right there, Dragonborn who worship dragons, Dragonborn who resent them, Dragonborn clans with entire mythologies built around a single ancient Wyrm somewhere in their past, and it mostly goes untouched. One last thing before I actually wrap this up, and it's a small one, but it drives me up the wall every time I see it skipped: Wyrmlings and eggs. The very early stages of a dragon's life basically never come up at most tables, because by the time a dragon's threatening enough to be worth a fight, it's already an adult or older, and the Wyrmling stage just gets treated as backstory nobody actually plays through. But a nest of dragon eggs sitting somewhere in a campaign is one of the single best story hooks this game has ever handed DMs for free, and it barely gets touched. Does the party burn the nest because dragons grow up to be city-flattening threats? Do they protect it because killing eggs feels monstrous even against monstrous creatures? Does one of them get attached to a Wyrmling and end up with the world's most dangerous pet, one that starts as a house cat-sized nuisance and eventually grows into something that could eat the tavern they met in? That's an entire character arc sitting inside 2 paragraphs of flavor text that 90% of tables never even open the book to. And honestly, while we're here, let's talk about the people who hunt these things, because dragon slayers as a concept get almost no love compared to the dragons themselves. Somewhere out there, in basically every setting with dragons in it, there should be people whose entire life's purpose revolves around killing them: guilds, bloodlines, cursed families obligated by some ancient pact to keep hunting the things generation after generation. That's a fantastic NPC well to draw from. An old, scarred dragon slayer who's killed 3 of these things and lost half their party each time is a phenomenal source of exposition, tension, and foreshadowing, way better than wise sage explains lore. They can tell the party exactly how badly this is going to go, from experience, and then the party gets to decide whether to listen or whether their pride's going to get them killed the same way it apparently got everyone else killed too. There's also just the physical lair itself, separate from lair actions as a mechanic, that gets criminally underused. A dragon's home should tell you everything about it before you've even met the thing. A hoard organized with obsessive precision tells you it's controlling and meticulous. A lair strewn with the bones of things it clearly didn't need to kill tells you it's cruel for the sake of being cruel. A cave with actual furniture, actual attempts at comfort, maybe books it can't even read but likes the look of, tells you there's something almost tragic about a creature this powerful still craving the trappings of a life it can't really have. None of that requires a single new rule. It's set dressing. But set dressing is doing an enormous amount of the emotional work in every good dragon story that's ever been told, and at the table it gets treated as an afterthought behind the actual stat block, when honestly it should probably come first. So where does that leave us? Running through literally everything we've talked about today is that dragons get treated as an encounter instead of a character, and that's backwards. A goblin ambush is an encounter. A trap-filled corridor is an encounter. A dragon, especially anything past the young age category, should be a character with motivations, history, ego, and a plan, one that just happens to also be capable of turning a party of adventurers into ash if it decides that's the correct move. The moment you start prepping a dragon the same way you'd prep an important NPC, figuring out what it wants, what it's afraid of, what it would rather avoid than risk, instead of just picking legendary actions off a list, the entire encounter changes shape. It stops being a math problem with wings and starts being the thing dragons were always supposed to be in the first place, which is the single scariest, smartest, most memorable thing your table's ever going to fight. So where does that leave us? Dragons, on paper, in the actual text of the books, are supposed to be ancient, cunning, physically massive, borderline unkillable forces of nature that a party should be terrified to even hear rumors about. In practice, at most tables, they're a big HP bar with one good attack that recharges too slowly and a checklist of legendary actions cycled through on autopilot. The gap between those two things isn't a math problem. It's not about buffing the numbers or adding more attacks per round. It's a role-playing problem, a pacing problem. Are you actually treating this thing like it's smarter than everyone at the table problem? And honestly, that's kind of a relief, because it means fixing it doesn't require homebrewing a single stat. It just requires remembering, every single time a dragon shows up, that you're not running a monster. You're running the closest thing this game has to a god that happens to have wings. As always, please consider if you wouldn't mind all the YouTube pleasantries, like, comment, subscribe, you know the ones. And of course, thank you for watching. Take care out there, and have a good one.